feel free to send them through on the Q&A section, and we'll aim at answering those questions towards the end of the episode. So today we added a bit more material to, as opposed to our previous StorageCraft webinars, but there is a lot of content that will be rehashed for someone that may have missed it before. So the first thing that we're going to cover is, why do you need a backup and recovery solution? So what we're listing on screen at the moment is basically a couple of reasons for data loss, and these statistics are obviously obtained out of the United States because that's where this information is readily available. But what you can see is that hardware failure and human error are by far the most likely reasons for data loss, with 40% and 29% respectively. Then there's also software corruption and theft, which are next in line with 13 and 9%. And then the most uncommon, albeit surprisingly, is viruses and destruction through other causes. Obviously, ransomware is becoming a more prevalent threat, and these statistics will probably change as that keeps growing in overall share, but the top two causes will likely remain, obviously, in the form of hardware failure and human error. Next, what are the differences between a backup and a DR solution? So as I'm sure everyone is aware, the idea of a backup solution is nothing more than having an extra copy of your data, whether it be on or off-site, and you basically only bring it back to you when you need it, like in the case of a machine reinstall or an accidental file deletion or something similar. A DR solution, on the other hand, replicates the actual computing environment with all of your data, all of your systems, your networks, and applications, all ready to be made available when the primary environment is not, for whatever reason that might be. It could be anything ranging from fire or theft or whatever the case may be. Then there are a couple of terms for recovery with the DR solution, namely cold, warm, or hot. So cold recovery is where you have the systems replicated in the form of images or VMs, which can either be stored locally or remotely, but nothing is actually loaded onto any extra server. And you basically initiate it on an ad hoc or as-needed basis. This is the slowest of the three recovery methods and happens to be the default in the vast majority of cases. Warm recovery, on the other hand, means that you have the servers on hosts that are configured, and you basically just need to load the data and spin up the servers. This is obviously faster as the recovery images are essentially ready to boot. Then hot recovery is where you have a redundant environment actually running in parallel to the primary or production environment, and all of the data is constantly being synced up. So this is often as part of a high availability function, or it's part of a mission critical application or service, and it's also often referred to as active failover. So StorageCraft happens to offer both cold and warm recovery methods. Then, of course, a DR solution comes with a few additional benefits or ways that it can be used or leveraged to benefit you. First and foremost, along with some of the topics that we'll cover later on, you can use the DR environment or server essentially as a sandbox, where you can use your production applications and everything else without touching your live or production environment itself. And this can therefore be used to test software updates or upgrades, new patches, or new use cases without posing any risk to the live or production environment. You can also use it similarly for planned maintenance or migrations or training, because you can use the DR environment while the work is being done on the production environment, ensuring that there's no downtime for your users or clients. And then, of course, it is actually also a backup solution and can be used as such. So DR solutions tend to include the ability to just grab files or folders without actually spinning up or referring to a completely separate environment. Then, what are some of the common backup mistakes? First and foremost, not checking or verifying your backups. This is obviously of paramount importance to ensure that you can actually recover following a disaster. There's obviously nothing worse than trying to recover from corrupt or incomplete backups. The second is that backup drives or destinations can run out of space. This is also, in most cases, an easily avoidable problem, and it should really be avoided because it can obviously lead to embarrassment on the part of the managed service provider, for example, if that's something that they were responsible for. Third, some competing solutions, particularly those that are file and folder based as opposed to being volume or partition based, may be unable to back up files that are locked due to them being open in some running software. So the common example would be something like a Outlook data file or a database of sorts, whether it be for Exchange or some other web-facing system. Fourth, the exclusion of files or folders could exclude potentially vital information withoat proper care. So you always need to make sure that the correct files are actually being copied during a backup. Fifth, the old adage of putting all your eggs in one basket. Obviously, things like theft, fire, floods, or lightning, or whatever the case may be, they can all destroy all of your data and backups if you store everything in one place. So it's important to use replication and not keep your data all in one single storage location. And then lastly, obviously, not having a proper backup schedule. As I'm sure everyone in an IT industry is aware, accidents rarely happen on any timely schedule. So you should always plan for the worst and essentially always be prepared. Next, and this is specifically for the MSPs, why would you want to sell a DR solution? So first and foremost, obviously, as I mentioned, their backup and disaster recovery as a service is an easy way of generating additional recurring revenue. And the reason is, if a customer approaches you for simply a break or fix, it means that you typically fix the problem and provide a solution and the customer leaves you. But as soon as you start offering a professional service around data protection, it means that there's a natural expansion of your relationship, especially in the case of a managed solution, because you now get recurring revenue and value from your customer. Most customers are looking for alternatives to traditional backup solutions, and a managed solution obviously presents an attractive alternative. Next, when you're protecting your customers' data, you basically become an indispensable partner for their business, right? So hiring any new provider or service provider to fix a problem is easy, but moving their data to a new protection service provider is not. And what's more, obviously, if your customer finally gets a data protection service that works well and meets their recovery point objectives and their recovery time objectives, it's going to be unlikely that they would want to leave you. So by providing a high level of satisfaction and retention, by providing a data protection service, the customers aren't going to move away because it tends to be quite a troublesome procedure for them. Next, of course, selling a strategic service like data protection means that you can completely change the relationship with your customer from being just another vendor that sells them hardware or software to being in a position where you can make strategic recommendations and actually deliver critical business systems. So by developing a business continuity plan with your customer, firstly, you gain a much deeper and broad understanding of what that customer actually does. And this means that further down the road, as you add additional products, or as you start selling some of our additional products, it means that you can add more value to the customer further down the road. And then, of course, one of the beauties of any service tied to data is that data typically grows at a minimum of 20% year on year. So this means that your data protection service will grow by an average of 20% even if you don't add any new customers. So this is why it's important to create a business model that's able to capture that data growth in the form of additional revenue. Next, and the last point here is that if you've made any kind of investment in infrastructure, you can leverage that investment by pointing your customers' data to your data center or to your infrastructure. So, and if you haven't made that investment and you don't want to, you can always point your customer data to your service provider and let them provide the hardware, software, and operations staff while you actually focus your energy on professional services, engagements, and sales. But the point remains that you can leverage existing infrastructure, whether you already have it with a provider or if you host it yourself, and use that to provide DR as a service. So the solution that we propose is obviously in the form of StorageCraft. And it's important to note that StorageCraft is a volume-based backup and recovery solution. So it backs up an entire partition or drive, so you don't back up simple files or folders. So one of the pain points that I mentioned in the previous slides, where you don't have a proper backup schedule, or if you don't have specific files or folders backed up, all of those problems are essentially negated entirely through the use of StorageCraft, because you can't exclude a specific file or folder because you're backing up an entire volume. And from a solutions perspective, they have coined the term recoverability, because the entire solution has been built in such a way that it focuses on the ability to recover whatever the disaster might be, as opposed to just making sure that your data is backed up. So just to highlight a few key features. First and foremost, it provides encryption. So you can encrypt the backup images that are created from any particular machine using AES 128 or 256-bit encryption. It's also a cross-platform solution, so you can use it to back up Windows and Linux machines. There is a central management component in the form of shadow control, where you can manage the backups and policies for your entire environment. And it's important to note that that management console happens to be multi-tenant as well. So if you end up deploying it as the disaster recovery as a service provider, it means that you have one console that you host and manage, and all of your customers' endpoints actually report into it, which means that you've got a very seamless and straightforward point to actually manage their backups and policies. It also includes the ability to restore to dissimilar hardware, using a component that's called Head Start Restore. And it basically means that you can perform migration. So you can go from physical to physical, or virtual to physical, or physical to virtual, or any combination of those. And the idea behind that Head Start Restore is that you're basically pre-staging your backup images to make it readily available following a disaster. So by using Head Start Restore, you're basically using the warm recovery method that I mentioned in one of the previous slides. Effectively, what it does is it pre-stages those backup images, and it means that you've got a machine disk on standby that you basically just need to attach to a machine, start it up, and you're back up and running from when that last backup was run. And the reason that it's therefore so quick is you essentially cut out the initial recovery time, because with a traditional backup or even a cold DR solution, it basically involves booting a recovery environment and then starting the recovery process. And the recovery process involves copying all of that data out of the backup image. Whereas in this case, that portion of the recovery process is already complete. And that's why it's so quick. Next, of course, as I mentioned, there's the ability to verify your backups. Now, that can be done in a number of ways. First, there is the component in StorageCraft called Image Manager. It's a free set of software that you install as part of your solution, and it basically verifies your backup images on an ongoing basis. And the way that it does that is by using a MD5 hash file that's created alongside every backup image, and you can then have those backup images re-verified, say once a day or once every 7 days or whatever the case may be. And all this does is it means that your backup image at rest is confirmed to be intact and not corrupt. But that doesn't necessarily mean that the data inside that backup image is intact. And that's why there is a component called virtual boot. So the idea behind virtual boot is as part of the temporary failover or as a way of testing your backups. It basically means that you take a backup image and you either start it up as a virtual machine inside VirtualBox, or you start it up as a virtual machine in Hyper-V. And by starting up the backup image as a VM, you've basically got confirmation that the operating system is working correctly and that your production application is intact and working, as well as your production data. The other idea behind the virtual boot is, as I mentioned, the temporary failover. And that's, as I mentioned in one of the previous slides, where you can use your DR environment while you're maybe performing maintenance or some other type of action on your production environment. because you can take this very same virtual machine, reconfigure the network interface, and make it available as if it was the production machine, for example. So virtual boot serves two bits of functionality, and you can basically verify the backups either by just starting it up as a VM or by relying on the MD5 hash checks. And then lastly, of course, as I mentioned, you can use a DR solution as a backup solution. So you can just as easily mount any backup image and then actually explore it and copy out files or folders in order to make sure that your backups are intact. Next, there is white labeling of the reports, which is obviously great for a managed service provider. And that functionality is also provided through Shadow Control, the central management system. So because everything's managed from one place, it's obviously where you've got all the reporting and logging information. And the reports that can be sent out, you can essentially change the company name and change the logo so that the report that goes out either to the management of the client or maybe a IT person or something like that, you can essentially have your company name represented on those reports as opposed to StorageCraft. And then lastly, there is the Granular Recovery for Exchange, or GRE for short. It's basically an add-on as part of the StorageCraft solution. Now, the important thing to note about the Granular Recovery for Exchange is that it does not actually require a StorageCraft license for Shadow Protect, which is obviously the backup agent. As long as you have a backup of your Exchange database, you can actually use the Granular Recovery for Exchange with that same database, even if it came from any other backup solution or provider. And what it allows you to do is, depending on the license model that you choose, it means that if a user goes and accidentally deletes a single mail or something like that, or an attachment or whatever the case may be, you can actually go in and recover that very specific mail. And depending on your license, you can even get a FTP or Explorer style interface where you can literally drag and drop mail items out of the backup straight back into your live Exchange server. So it means that rather than recovering the entire Exchange server and essentially rolling it back to a previous point in time and discarding any new mails that may have arrived after the last backup, you're only recovering the individual items that you need to. From a pricing perspective, it obviously fits medium to enterprise clients, but that doesn't mean that we've forgotten about the small businesses. There are bundles available, which essentially include, say, for example, 5 or 10 desktop licenses and a single server license. So it basically means that you don't have to look at separate license keys, and you've got one bundle that provides you with the appropriate level of protection. There is also a monthly billing option available as part of the MSP program. It's important to note that there is a minimum monthly commitment of $100, but $100 minimum monthly order is actually very small. It basically means, I think if I recall correctly, it's basically 2 or 3 servers and maybe 4 or 5 desktops, and that easily covers the minimum monthly requirement. So even if you just sign up one decent-sized customer or 1 or 2 small customers, you immediately reach that minimum monthly obligation in order to qualify for the MSP program. And next, of course, because it's a volume-based solution, it is built per system, not per gig. So we don't care how much data you're backing up, just the system that you are backing up. And then from a licensing perspective in that regard, we differentiate between physical and virtual, and between server and workstation. So obviously physical is more expensive than virtual, and server is more expensive than workstation. Then from a competitor's perspective, we obviously come up against a couple of industry-leading vendors, the most common of which happens to be Symantec's Backup Exec. We also see a lot of Acronis, Veeam, and Unitrends. There are a couple of other competitors as well, and it's also important to note that if you have a customer with one of the valid list of competitors, which you'll see in our price list, you can actually qualify for significant discounts. So it means that if you're basically trying to displace an existing vendor at one of your customers, you can easily do so because the licensing is hugely discounted. Next, there are a couple of extra integrations. First and foremost, there's integration into Pulseway, which is our remote monitoring and management system. If you're not familiar with it, please look at our portfolio, and also please look at the information around it on our wiki. There's data sheets and other documentation. There's a few comparisons, and we've also done past webinars on Pulseway. So if you haven't seen that, then go and have a look. It's obviously a great monitoring solution for all areas of IT infrastructure. And it basically allows you to monitor the successful or failed backups, as well as whether or not an agent license is due to expire. And you can then specify the number of days prior to that license expiry that you want to be notified. Next, there's also a couple of hypervisor plugins available for both VMware and Microsoft System Center. It basically enables you to see a range of information from Shadow Control directly either in VMware's vCenter or the virtual machine manager in Microsoft System Center, such as being able to monitor the backup status of each job, including backup time, size, as well as the next scheduled backup. It also allows you to see all of the VMs that are actually running on a hypervisor host and automatically detect which VMs are not protected by Shadow Protect. It also gives you the ability to easily transition from either vCenter or Microsoft System Center to Shadow Control with a single click. And it basically gives you access to more detailed information, or to the reports, or to specific logs when needed. And then lastly, it also provides the ability to push install the Shadow Protect agent directly to any unprotected VM. And it even allows you to apply a pre-configured backup job for immediate protection of the VM in question. So obviously with that, with all of these hypervisor plugins, it simply means that not only do you have more visibility in a single management console for your virtual infrastructure, but you can actually easily integrate and add additional protection for VMs as you create them. Next, there's a small diagram of a typical StorageCraft deployment, and I'm just going to explain this very briefly. The little blue icon with a shield that you see on the servers, on the VMs, on the workstations, and so on, it basically represents the Shadow Protect backup agent, which needs to be installed on every machine that you wish to back up. Everything's obviously connected to some type of central network. In this case, I just have one router. But the idea is that you have all of these backup agents sending their backup data to some type of central storage. And in the bottom left, you can see that I've got a NAS. So the idea behind StorageCraft is that you're essentially storing all of your backup data in one location. So that can be a big file server, it can be a NAS, it can be a SAN, it can be anything. It can even be a shared external drive as an example. But the point is that you should ideally have a single storage location, because it means that you can manage all of your backup images easily and efficiently. Next, in the far bottom left-hand corner, I've got what I've labeled as a BDR device. And that's where you would install Image Manager, which is part of the StorageCraft solution. Now, the reason that I've positioned that to the bottom left is it's basically just to highlight that you have to have a dedicated device for the running of Image Manager. And that can be another VM, it can be a spare workstation, a spare laptop, or just a normal workstation that's always on. Because the role of Image Manager is firstly the automated verification that I mentioned using the MD5 hash files. It's also responsible for the replication jobs, whether those replication jobs are going to another local storage destination or going over the internet to an offsite location, for example. And it's also responsible for the Head Start Restore functionality, where you can use that warm recovery method that I mentioned. So with all of those responsibilities, it's important that Image Manager is always running permanently on a network, wherever that might be. The other important thing to highlight is because it's a volume-based DR solution. That's also why there is an agent installed inside each virtual machine, as opposed to just backing up the actual virtual machine disk file, because it means that you can recover that individual virtual machine to a previous point in time using all of its production data that might be inside it as well, as opposed to working with a very large backup image where you wouldn't be able to do incremental backups, for example. Unless, of course, you're relying on the snapshot capability that might be as part of your hypervisor. Next, in the far right, we've got two items. The first is shadow control, and that's obviously just to indicate the position of the central management system. So shadow control is intended to be hosted by you as the MSP, for example, and all of the agents sitting at all of your customers report back into that single management console. So you can basically consider this diagram as, say, client A, and you can have another one similar to this, could be client B and client C and so on, and all of them essentially report back into a single instance of shadow control, which you've made available over the internet. Then you've also got the MSP replication servers just to the left of that in the form of either ShadowStream or IFTP. The difference between the two is actually really straightforward. They're basically just optimized for different grades of internet connections. So ShadowStream is intended for environments with high latency and low bandwidth, because what it does is it takes a single backup image, which could obviously be very large. Let's say, for example, it's a 100 gig backup image, and it basically divides it up into tiny pieces and uses multiple connections and streams in order to transmit it to the replication server. So the benefit of that is if the transfer gets interrupted at any point in time, it basically only needs to retransfer that portion that had failed. Whereas the IFTP method, which is also referred to as intelligent FTP, it obviously uses FTP, so that's file transfer protocol. And as I'm sure most of you are aware, with a large FTP transfer, if it happens to fail, it usually has to start from the beginning again, because most FTP servers don't support resume. And that basically means that if you've got, again, a 100 gig image, even if it fails at 99%, you basically have to retransfer the entire 100 gig image from scratch. So that can obviously pose a number of issues for other networks, and that's why the IFTP method is generally intended for environments with low latency and high bandwidth. Next, I'm going to quickly do an actual demo of the software, so give me one moment while I switch to that. In the meantime, I don't see any questions as of yet, so if you've got any questions, please remember to send those through, and we'll aim at answering those as we go along. All right, so you should be able to see a ShadowProtect SPX management console in front of you at the moment. So this is running on our file server in our little demo environment. The first thing that I want to illustrate is, obviously, you can see that there's a backup job in place. You can see what's being backed up. You can see its current status, so you can see that it actually ran a backup fairly recently, and it's currently listed as queued. You can see the next backup time, and you can see that it was successful the last time that it ran. The other important thing is you can see that this is a backup that has been implemented as a shadow control policy. So this is a backup job that I applied through shadow control, which I'll show you in a moment. But the main point that I want to highlight here is when you implement a backup policy through shadow control, the users can't actually tamper with that backup job. So I can try and edit this job or delete it or whatever the case may be, and you'll immediately get this error saying that it can't actually be managed or edited through the SPX interface. You have to do it through shadow control, which means that once you've implemented this on a client environment, the users, even if they are local admins, can't tamper with that backup policy or change settings or change the time. And it means that you are certain of the fact that the backup job always remains in place as you've configured it. The other thing is the job timeline. So all of the little green lines that you should be able to see are indications of successful backups. So you can see that I'm running this backup once every 15 minutes. I have been running this backup for a very long time, but the total disk usage is actually only 7.2 gigs, and that can be as a result of the compression that has been assigned. And you can also see that my incremental backups are actually very, very small. So the one line where the timeline is currently positioned, that was the last incremental backup that was done. And it only needed to back up a mere 1.1 megabytes, because that's the maximum volume of data that has actually changed since the last backup that was done 15 minutes ago. Next, you can also do a couple of things from here. You can view information on the image. You can mount the image, and that obviously, as I mentioned earlier, can serve two purposes. The one is to do a test, so you can take your data, you can copy it out, and you can open it up in order to make sure that the data is actually intact, to do a basic test of your backup image. And the second point is maybe you have accidentally deleted something and you actually need to recover a portion of that data. You can also initiate a volume restore, so that would restore the actual volume to a previous point in time. And you can also perform a manual verification task. So this is exactly the same process that would be followed if you're using the automated verification as part of Image Manager. And then lastly, you can obviously just change some visibility information. Next, what I'm going to show you quickly is Image Manager. So I've got Image Manager running here for the backups that are currently created out of my demo environment. You can see the status of each item if you expand it. So I've got a domain controller over there. I've got the file server that I was viewing at, a moment ago with the backup management console, and I've got a few other servers in here as well. So as I mentioned, Image Manager has a range of responsibilities. First and foremost, it's obviously responsible for the automated verification that I mentioned. It's also responsible, as I mentioned, for the head start restore as well as the replication. But it's also responsible for your retention policies. So how long do you want to keep a specific backup image? It also has the ability to throttle the verification or the replication tasks, which can be very useful if you've got a limited internet connection, because it means that rather than hogging an internet connection and using all of the available bandwidth, you can essentially throttle that job to ensure that maybe it's only using a maximum of, let's say, 1 megabit per second as an easy use case. And it means that the rest of the available capacity on that internet connection is available for the rest of the office as it should. So you're not basically negatively impacting the users on the network by maxing out the connection for a replication task. Also, depending on the speed of your local network and the speed of the storage where the backup images are stored, you may want to modify the concurrent processing values for the number of jobs or folders that can be processed simultaneously. Then, as I mentioned, it can also do your retention. So one of the things that StorageCraft can do is it can take a particular backup image, right? Let's say, in my case, I am running it once every 15 minutes, as you saw with my file server there. And that would mean that during the course of a day, you're sitting with well over 40 backup images. So if a user doesn't remember a specific point in time on a specific day that they may have deleted a file, for example, it would be very difficult to find the actual incremental backup image that was done during the course of the day in order to find a particular document, for example. So what it'll do is it will consolidate those backup images, firstly, into consolidated daily images, consolidated weekly images, and if you prefer, you can also use consolidated monthly images. So if we just speak about the daily images as an example, it means that now you've got a particular day where it's got all of the changes that occurred on your server during that day. So as long as the user knows which day, you can easily reference the consolidated daily image, find the data that they're looking for, and recover it accordingly. Or alternatively, if they didn't remember the day, at the very least, now you've got multiple daily images that you can check, as opposed to having to check 40 images for a single day, as an example. So as you can see there, I'm keeping my intra-daily images only for one day. I am keeping my consolidated daily images for a week, my weekly images for a month, and then my monthly images for an additional month. And then, of course, just because it's easy to reference many individual files in one folder, I'm also opting to move the consolidated images to a subdirectory as opposed to deleting them. So, as I mentioned, you can see that I'm backing up. That's my domain controller over there. The nice thing here is I can now add the jobs that I've mentioned. So if I wanted to add a new replication job, I'd be able to add it over here. I can send that replicated information either to a local drive, which happens to be free, so there's no license required if you replicate backup images to another local drive. As soon as it touches the network, however, that is when you require an appropriate license. So if you're going to be using network drive, which is obviously another storage location on the local network, that requires a license. Alternatively, you can send it to an IFTP server, which I mentioned briefly, or a shadow stream server. You can ignore the legacy option because that is available as part of an older version of the software, which will be decommissioned at some point in the future. And the StorageCraft cloud services, where you use them as the replication destination, is not yet available in Africa. So we'll ignore that option as well. So if I was to select, say, Shadow Stream, which is something that I have set up in my environment, I'd be able to select the server in question as well as its share. Obviously, in my case, this is on a local IP address, but in a production environment, this would probably be some kind of fully qualified domain name, as an example. I can also throttle this particular job if I'd like to, so I can override the global throttling value that I showed previously. I can also opt to not replicate the base image. Now, this is very important, especially for a new backup, because what will happen with a continuous incremental backup schedule, which I'll cover later on when I get to shadow control, it starts with the first full backup for an entire drive or partition. So that can obviously be quite large. So let's say it's a 100 gig file, again, as an example. It means that you don't have to use your internet connection to replicate that massive 100 gig image. You can opt to not replicate the base image and only start replicating the incremental images after the first base image, and then it's basically up to you as the disaster recovery as a service provider or just as the user of the software to manually copy the base image from the original backup destination over to the replication server. But that basically means that you can take the backup image, you can pop it onto an external drive as an example, and then take the external drive directly to the replication destination, as opposed to, as I mentioned, copying all of that over an internet connection, which might not be feasible. You can also optionally compress and encrypt the data stream for the replication job, but as you can see in the bottom point there, it's only necessary if your original images were not already compressed or encrypted. So if you've already compressed and encrypted them, you're not going to get any benefit from using the compression or encryption of the data stream. And next, you can also set it up in essentially a daisy chain configuration. So in my case, that's not going to happen. But let's say, for example, you had multiple DR locations, right? So now I'm replicating the images from this location to a DR location. I could then again replicate the images from the DR location to a second DR location. So you can daisy chain the replication of StorageCraft to multiple environments for absolute redundancy. Next, the other thing that I'm quickly going to show you is, of course, shadow control. So that's what should be available on your screen at the moment. So as I mentioned, shadow control is the central management system for your backups and policies. So from the dashboard, you can obviously see a range of things. You can see the shadow protect status for all of the endpoints in the environment, which is obviously the backup agent. You can see the status of image manager, however many installations there are. And you can also see the status of the shadow control agent. Now that's an important point to note. When you want to use shadow control, firstly, shadow control is free. So it's a completely optional component, but it obviously offers so many benefits that it would be almost counterintuitive not to use it. But it does require an additional agent to be installed on each machine that you are backing up. So wherever you're installing Shadow Protect, you'll probably also be installing Shadow Control. And the only role of the Shadow Control agent is to make that machine's Shadow Protect or Image Manager manageable through this web interface. You can also see that I've got updates available, which I'll show you in a moment. And you can see current status events or notifications. So you can see that one endpoint in my environment is currently unresponsive in the case of Shadow Protect. There are no notifications in the case of Image Manager, and there was a push install error on 3 endpoints for Shadow Control. And then you can also see a past log. So these are events that are not necessarily current, that had happened in the environment at a previous point in time. Next, as I mentioned, this is a multi-tenant solution. So if you wanted to drill down into a particular organization, obviously in my case, I've only got the one, but you could have other organizations in this list and then drill down into only seeing that environment status as a whole. Next, I'm just quickly going to go to the endpoint view. So you can see that these are all of the machines that are in my environment. The little green icon that you may see here on the right under the installed product section indicates all of the machines and the relevant software where there are updates available. So you can see that I do have a couple of updates that I need to run across my environment. You can also see where those endpoints are, so you can see which organization they are associated with, as well as potentially which site or location. So that's the other important point. Aside from adding many organizations, you can also add sub-locations to those organizations. So maybe the office in one city and an office in another city, or the office in another country, or something like that. And the reason that you can granularly define the layout of the endpoints is because it means that you can actually apply a backup policy to that location. So it means that all of the machines in my sub-location, which is my demo environment, have a particular policy applied, which may be different to the policy that's applied to the global organization, or may be different to the policy applied to the endpoint specifically located in South Africa, as an example. Then if I quickly view, let's just pick one of these servers, you can see a whole bunch of information relating to this endpoint. You can obviously see that this is a server 2012 VM that is busy being backed up. You can see some resource utilization. You can also tag the machine. And the reason for tagging a machine is, again, because Shadow Control is multi-tenant. Let's say you've got thousands of endpoints enrolled into the solution. You don't want to go to the main endpoint view and then scroll and page through different results in order to find the particular endpoint. You may be able to tag the machine. So you can either tag them with a customer name, or you can tag them. Maybe you want to work on all of the servers that you manage immediately, and then all of the endpoints, or all of the workstations, or all of the laptops. So you can tag them using logical values, and those tags are actually searchable. So if I was to search over here, you'd be able to find anything labeled infrastructure, or find anything labeled server, or find anything labeled Windows, and manage those directly. You can also see the license that's assigned. And again, you can also see the backup job that is assigned, some status around it, where it might be backing up to, what volumes are available, whether or not Image Manager is installed, and maybe you want to remotely reboot the endpoint or unsubscribe it from the system. If I then view a machine where I actually have Image Manager installed, let's have a look at this one over here. So again, you can see there is the Image Manager section down here specifically. You can see the license key that's assigned, you can see the number of folders that are managed, and you can see the last successful update for this particular application. If I then go into folder details in particular, you can see all of the folders that are actually managed, and that's the same that you can see in the previous section that I showed you when I was showing Image Manager in particular. And you can also see warnings from here for a particular folder as an example. Next, you can add a backup store over here. So that's obviously the backup locations. It is important to note that the backup stores or locations need to be local to the endpoint in question. So if I was to add a backup store, it may be worthwhile to name them in the same fashion. So you could call this, say, Client A workstations, Client A servers, Client B workstations, Client B servers, and then the path that you specify would be local to those endpoints, so that when you apply it, you're actually sure that the data is going to be able to get there. Then once you've got your backup stores configured, you can obviously create your backup policies. So adding a new backup policy is actually really straightforward. You give the policy a name, so I'm just going to call this test. You can select a predefined protection scheme, so in this case it will back up all available volumes, or you maybe want to select just the operating system volumes, or maybe only the data volumes because you want to apply a different policy to each type of volume. You then select the location for those backup images. You then select the level of compression that you want to use. So there's obviously standard and best or none. Standard compression is estimated to save you approximately 40% of disk utilization or space, whereas the high compression method can save approximately 50%. But it is important to note that because compression is a CPU intensive task, the high compression method, considering it only saves you at best an additional 10%, that you only use it in environments where the machines aren't necessarily very busy in terms of resource utilization because of it being a resource-intensive task. Then, as I mentioned, you can apply various levels of encryption, either in the form of AES 128 or 256-bit, and you specify a password for the backup images that are created, and that's that. Then for the schedule, there's obviously a couple of options available. There is the continuous incremental backup schedule, which, as we've mentioned, it creates a full backup as a base image, and then backs up only incremental backups from that point forward, so only the data that has changed in between the backup schedules. There's also a mixed mode, which basically allows you to have a regular full backup as well as an incremental backup that is done. The benefit of running a mixed backup is, think of it this way. If I'm sitting with a backup schedule that's running once every 15 minutes, and I've been running this backup job for, let's say it's a couple of months, when I then need to initiate a recovery process, the recovery task needs to reference every single backup image in between the date that I selected and the original base image. And that can obviously take some time. So it might be beneficial if you're running a mixed backup schedule that the full backup is actually quite recent. So the number of images that it needs to reference are less. And as a result, it's obviously a bit quicker and often a bit more efficient. Then you can also configure a full schedule. So this is literally nothing more than a full backup that is done every so often. Maybe this is a machine where incremental backups don't offer a major benefit and it's just easier to do a full backup schedule. And then, of course, there's the manual option as well. And this is basically, let's say I know that I want to do an update of sorts, or I need to install patches or something like that. I can then just add a full backup schedule on a manual basis and then run it on an endpoint on a case-per-case basis, so that I have a full backup to immediately fall back on in the event that the update fails or something like that. And then from an advanced perspective, there is again a couple of options. First, you can throttle the performance of the backup job. So you can limit the amount of resource utilization while that job is running. So maybe it's a server that you know is always quite busy, and you don't want the backup job to immediately bog down the server. So you can limit the resource utilization so that you can basically ensure that the server remains up and available with its production applications to the users as necessary while the backup is actually running in the background. I'm not going to go into all of these in a lot of detail, but other things that I'd like to highlight is the ability to auto-execute missed backups. This is especially useful for either a machine that's gone off the network or gone offline, or maybe a laptop that leaves the network on a regular basis, because it means that, let's say I take my laptop outside of the office, and when I come back, at the next point that a backup schedule is initiated, it'll actually back up all of the data during all of the previous backup schedules that were actually missed. So it means that I will have a complete backup once that machine rejoins the network, as opposed to only sitting with the last set of backups. So I would basically always enable this option to account for any random issues that might occur. And then you can also split the backup images into smaller files. So this can be useful if you're still using some type of fixed length media for archiving of the backup images. Let's say you're copying the backup images onto a tape system, for example, or onto Blu-ray discs or something like that. You can basically make sure that those images are actually going to fit by setting the split file size. And then you can also add a range of scripts. So obviously there's the start, pre-snapshot, post-snapshot, and finish scripts, and they can all be used for different purposes. One of the easy use cases there, which I always use when I discuss the product, is when I used to do a lot of on-site work, one of the more painful things to work with were old pastel accounting servers, and the really old versions were notorious for not honoring a VSS snapshot. So what you could do as a pre-snapshot script is stop the database service, and then post-snapshot start the database service again so that the accounting system resumes and actually is available to the users again, as opposed to needing to stop it manually, do the backup, and then restart it them again manually afterwards. So this enables you to automate a lot of those actions. And then maybe as a finished job script, you immediately want to copy the backup images to another location. By using the finished job script, you can obviously do that as well. Next, there's a couple of application settings that I want to highlight. I'm not going to go into all of these, but at a glance, you can obviously see system information and resource utilization. You can set the time zone, which is obviously important for logging. You can take a backup of the appliance and all of the endpoints and all of your backup policies and backup stores so that you can maybe migrate to a new shadow control server as an example. You can also reconfigure the network interface. You can also add an SSL certificate under the security section. You can configure a mail server as an SMTP gateway for email notifications from shadow control. And then you can also apply branding. So this is the rebranding capability that we mentioned, which will apply to the email alert notifications as well as the reports, where you can then substitute your company name and your company logo as an example. You can also set up the destination for the notifications that need to go out. So this can maybe go to your support department as an example. And then there's a range of endpoint installation instructions, and this is specifically for the shadow control agent on a number of different operating systems. Next, as I mentioned, you can add many different organizations. So as you can see, I've got a number of sub-organizations for ESET Africa. I can just as easily go and add a new organization, give it a name, so that can be client A, for example. And then I can also set, as I mentioned, a predefined backup policy. It basically just means that when you enroll endpoints into shadow control, you can easily just move them to the necessary organization, and they will have the appropriate backup policy automatically applied. So it just means that your actual deployment process is shorter and more efficient. And then you can also define primary and secondary contacts, and they can then optionally be used for the reports or for the alerts. So maybe it is a larger customer, you are the DR as a service provider, but they happen to have an on-site IT person or department. So for normal issues like maybe looking at disk space or something like that, you can elect to send the alerts directly to that on-site person who works with that infrastructure on a day-to-day basis so that they can fix those issues, and you obviously worry about the larger problems that might arise. Then you can also set up various status rules. So if I was to add a new policy, this can again be client A workstations as an example. So I might want to apply a particular notification and rule policy only to the workstations at that client. In this case, what will happen is I want to be alerted if the shadow control agent becomes unresponsive. I want to be alerted if the backup jobs fail. I want to be alerted if there is a failure rate of 2 or above compared to the last 4 total backups. Maybe I want to be alerted if the last VSS backup failed. Maybe someone accidentally paused a backup job if they needed to do some type of maintenance, for example, but forgot to resume the backup job. The last thing you want is thinking that someone has worked on a server that you still have backups, and then when you really need it, it turns out that that backup job has been paused for an extended period of time and you don't actually have a backup to fall back on. You also want to be alerted around disk usage. So as I mentioned in one of the earliest slides is the common backup issues. Last thing you want is to just run out of space for your backup, so you can obviously be alerted to that. You also should be alerted if there's any incremental job that is unmanaged. It's important to note that if you choose the continuous incremental backup schedule, if you do not manage those backup images that are created through Image Manager, you will not actually be able to recover. So it's incredibly important to make sure that all incremental jobs are being managed through Image Manager. Next, and this is specific to the MSP licenses, you can be alerted if there's a license expiry. Same thing for subscription licenses. And then you can also be alerted if the Shadow Protect agent or service becomes unresponsive. Then exactly the same like with Shadow Protect, you've also got similar rules for Image Manager. Again, because this is managing the total or main storage location, you want to be alerted if that's running out of space. You want to be alerted if verification tasks fail, or if consolidation fails, or if there's a number of jobs that are stuck in the replication queue that are not actually completing, or if, again, the MSP license is due to expire, or if the Image Manager service has become unresponsive. Next, obviously, there are you can set up many user accounts and user roles, so you can have obviously different levels of permissions for accessing the system. Maybe you need a read-only access or something like that. You can also create tokens so that you can essentially pull information from the system using the API as opposed to using actual user-based authentication. And then lastly, on the report side, I'm just going to run the full report quickly so that you can see what I'm referring to. Here you can see the rebranding at play. It's obviously quite straightforward. It just replaces the logo and replaces the company name. You can see the same information that you see in the general status dashboard. You can see information around all the Shadow Protect endpoints. You can see the status around any of the Image Manager jobs and tasks that are available. And you can see a storage forecast. So the important thing to note about the storage forecast is it becomes more accurate the longer the backup policies remain in place. So it basically means that if you're running it for a couple of months, the forecast for, say, the next 12 months will be significantly more accurate. And an easy use case here is when I initially implemented the solution, within the first week, it was estimated that after a year, I'll need well over about 3 or 4 petabytes of storage. Whereas as soon as it's been running for an extended period of time, because there wasn't a massive amount of information that suddenly changed, which would have affected the forecast, now you can see that over the next 12 months, I only need to allocate, I only need to make sure that there's about 1 terabyte of storage available after a year. So as you can see, it becomes hugely accurate the longer that those backup jobs are actually running and the system is generating that logging information. The last thing that I'm going to show you is how to initiate a virtual boot task. It's really straightforward. So this is the SPX agent running on my laptop. What I'm going to do is select virtual boot out of the menu over here. I have a VirtualBox installed, and that's what I'm going to use for the virtual boot method as opposed to Hyper-V. I am going to add a backup image. Now, I happen to have copied the backup image onto my local machine for the purposes of this demo. It happens to be our ESET Secure Authentication server. I'm going to select the last incremental backup that was done in this case. And then I'm going to select that image. Because the backup images are actually encrypted, I need to type in a password in order to access that backup image and actually attach it to the virtual machine. I'm going to give this machine a name. I'm going to give it some more RAM because I know that this virtual machine happened to have 2 gig assigned and 512 megs will be a bit difficult, so I'm going to give it about 1.5 gigs just to make sure that it runs optimally. And then the next thing is I can attach a network adapter. And this will be incredibly important if you want to use this machine as a temporary failover. Whereas in this case, I'm just going to use it as if I'm testing the backup. So I'm going to leave that as not attached. I obviously want to automatically start the virtual machine as soon as it's been created. So I'm going to say go ahead and create this backup image. So that task has started in the background. We'll give it a couple of moments to get going in order to show you the virtual boot process. In the meantime, I see that there are still no questions that have come through on our Q&A. So please make sure that you send through those questions soon, because after the virtual boot, that'll essentially wrap up today's webinar. So I'm just going to give this a couple of moments. This is obviously taking that image, copying all of the data across into a virtual machine disk in order for VirtualBox to actually start up that VM. So we'll give it a couple of moments. So it started up. Let me just move that window across so where we can see VirtualBox has come up. Windows is starting to boot. And when this machine is finished booting, it basically means that I've now done a full end-to-end test of my backup image, because now I'll be able to log into this virtual machine. I'll be able to make sure that the operating system is intact. I'll be able to make sure that the production data is intact and that the production applications are actually functioning correctly. So we'll give that a moment to complete the disk check. Obviously, you could have skipped that depending on the purposes of the task. I'm just going to let this complete, but it basically gives you an idea of what this functionality will do. It basically just means you take any backup image and start it up as a virtual machine and then do a full test of that backup image. So that essentially wraps up today's webinar. I still don't have any questions that have come through, so I will give everyone that is attending a couple of moments to send those through if you have it. Well, I'm giving everyone a couple of moments to still send through any questions. Just to note, we do obviously upload our webinars to the wiki. So if you need to re-watch this, or if there's any information that you need to show a colleague or something like that, you can re-watch any of our webinars straight from our wiki as soon as we've uploaded it following the session. So I still don't have any questions that have come through. So that essentially wraps up today's session. If anyone has any questions that they need to ask about the solution, or if you need any documentation, or if you need pricing or anything along those lines, please feel free to get in touch. You can obviously email us at partners@esadafrica.com or use the contact us page available on the wiki. But thank you very much for everyone that has attended today. I hope today's session was informative, and I will see you all next week.